Hello there and welcome. Before you get too comfortable, just a little reminder, if you enjoy these quiet ramblings, do consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps us keep telling these stories ever so gently. And if you feel like it, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always lovely to picture this wide little community all dozing off at different corners of the map. Now, dim the lights. Ease into your pillow, maybe give your shoulders a gentle little drop if they've crept up too high, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin not with a bang, but with a scratch in the soil. Long before the engines and the steel, before tractors carved tidy lines across wide fields, there was only the land and the hand that tended it. This is the story of the plough. Not as an invention that changed everything overnight, but as a slow, steady companion in the quiet evolution of human life. Picture it, if you will, a patch of earth under an open sky. No towns, no maps, just the breath of wind in the tall grass, and someone stooping with a stick, prodding, poking, coaxing the earth to yield. We often imagine history as a series of grand events, kings and battles and bustling cities, but the truer story, the quieter one, lies in these humble gestures. A farmer at dawn, a child watching the soil crumble under a worn tool, a family laying seed in the soft loam, hoping for rain. This tale of the plough is not about genius or glory. It is about patience. It is about repetition. It is about the rhythms that governed the lives of countless unnamed folk, whose legacy lies not in words or monuments, but in furrows and food, in harvests gathered and meals shared. So tonight we will wander through time together, not racing, not rushing, but slowly tracing the plough's path from the first scratch of wood against dirt, all the way to its iron bones cutting through the modern world. We'll listen to the stillness of ancient mornings, the creak of yokes, the hush of soil turned over. And we'll remember, perhaps, just how much of our world rests on this one quiet invention. Long before there were furrows in the field, before the wooden frames and the yoked oxen, there was only the land, untamed, unturned, and vast in its quiet constancy. Early human societies, still largely nomadic, would have wandered across landscapes not yet marked by ownership or the straight lines of agriculture. The earth was a wild expanse of grasses and shrubs, of forests and stony patches, with the promise of nourishment hidden just beneath its surface. The earliest attempts at cultivation were hesitant, almost experimental, more an extension of gathering than farming. Perhaps it began with the scattered seeds of wild grasses, trodden accidentally into soft earth and returning come the rains as a patch of green. A primitive memory may have formed that the ground, if disturbed just slightly and given time, might return more than it was given. There was no need yet for a plough. The fingers, the feet, the simplest of sticks, these were enough. Digging sticks, little more than sharpened branches, were among the first tools used to break the earth. With them, early humans might loosen the soil, poke holes for seed, or dislodge the roots of edible plants. These tools were primitive in form, but the gestures they enabled were the first acts of agriculture. Imagine the slowness of it, the quiet crouch beside a patch of soil, the feel of the earth yielding slightly beneath the point of wood. This was a time before pressure, before surplus, before the weight of a hungry population demanded innovation. Subsistence was small-scale and seasonal. What could be grown in a modest clearing or beside a stream might support a small group if the weather held and the pests stayed away. There were no granaries, no markets, no idea yet of wheat as currency, just food, plain and necessary. Over time, the digging stick was refined. Stones were lashed to the ends to make the tip more durable, more effective. Handles were smoothed by calloused hands, passed down and modified. In various corners of the world, other tools appeared: the hoe, the mattock, the adze. Each was an answer to the same question: how to make the earth yield without breaking one's back. But these remained hand tools, and the work was intimate. The soil was not yet something to be conquered or controlled. It was a partner, unruly and slow. Communities began to settle. The seasonal camps grew more permanent. With permanence came predictability, and with predictability came the idea of improving things, of easing the burden. As people lingered longer in one place, the need to produce more food from a given patch of land became clear. More mouths meant more effort. The digging stick, once sufficient, now began to strain under the weight of expectation. Still, it is worth pausing here, in this pre-furrowed world, and taking stock of its quiet. The slow progress of early cultivation was not a failure of ingenuity. It was a reflection of a rhythm unhurried by clocks or calendars. Days were measured by light and weather, by the flight of birds, by the colour of the sky at dusk. The seasons came and went, and in their wake people adjusted, adapted, endured. This was the prelude to the plough, a long, slow prelude of simple tools and simpler expectations. Yet even here, in this early age, the seeds of change were quietly being sown. Each scratched line in the soil, each bent stick, each patch of sprouting grain was a whisper of what would come, a quiet foreshadowing of the furrows to come. As the centuries passed, the soil continued to receive its gentle scratchings. Children would learn by watching their elders poke and prod the ground. The ground itself, silent, patient, absorbed the work, and in time the stick would give way to something new, something heavier, something pulled not by hand but by the broad shoulders of another creature entirely. But for now we linger in the hush of those early fields, the world still largely unploughed, the future curled like a seed in the palm. In the gentle hush of ancient landscapes, where time moved with the slowness of sun shadows and the ebb of wild rivers, the digging stick held a modest reign. It was a tool of extraordinary simplicity, just a length of wood, sometimes hardened in fire, occasionally tipped with a stone or bone, but it marked the beginning of a profound shift in human life. The first real gesture of our kind towards agriculture, towards reshaping the land rather than simply wandering it. One can imagine it easily, a person, bent at the waist, prodding at the soil under the heat of a still sun. Around them, a few gathered seeds, or perhaps bulbs to be unearthed. The tool itself would have been carved from nearby branches, perhaps from trees, known to offer straight grain and sturdiness. Hazel, ash, or even a pale, dry limb of acacia in more arid lands. These early tools were not designed in the way we might think of design now. They evolved through use, through feel, through trial and quiet error. But though it was a start, the digging stick was, by its very nature, a limited thing. It could not turn large areas of land. It could not aerate deeply. It was suitable for small patches, perhaps a few meters across, laboured over by hand, foot, and perseverance. The stick broke often, splintered at the tip, or wore away with time. It was less a machine than a makeshift extension of the body, a way to nudge the soil rather than command it. Its use was seasonal, dictated by rains and warmth. After the first rains, when the soil had softened just enough, people would go out with their sticks and begin to make holes for seeds. There was no question of straight rows or even spacing. Crops were scattered, clustered, mixed with weeds and wild plants. The harvest, when it came, would be gathered by hand, carefully and slowly, sometimes shared with birds and beetles, sometimes lost to drought. In these early stages, the limitations of the digging stick weren't so much a problem as they were a natural fact, like the length of the day or the depth of the stream. People lived within those constraints, not necessarily seeking to transcend them. There was a kind of balance, and with it, a slowness that modern eyes might struggle to understand. But as populations began to grow, however slightly, and as people stayed longer in one place, those quiet limitations became more pronounced. More land needed tending, more food needed planting. The stick, once reliable, became a bottleneck. Work was slow, repetitive, and achingly hard on the body, bending over for hours, pressing the tool into compacted earth, coaxing each small hole into place. It was a labour measured in soreness and time. Some groups began to pair the digging stick with other implements. A hoe might be used to clear surface vegetation first. A fire might be lit to burn off brush, softening the topsoil. In some regions, stones were laid out to retain warmth in the soil. These were clever innovations, but they only stretched the tool's usefulness so far. The deeper layers of earth remained largely untouched. Moreover, as human groups began to observe patterns in the land, they would have noticed something else. The soil tired. After a few seasons of planting, yields diminished. Nutrients, though not understood in scientific terms, were clearly being depleted. The earth needed rest, or it needed stirring. Something had to break below the surface and bring new richness upward. The digging stick, light and shallow, could not reach deep enough to do this. There was also the matter of animals. As some groups domesticated dogs, goats, and eventually cattle, it became clear that these creatures were not only companions or sources of food, but workers. The idea, tentative at first, that strength could be borrowed from another species began to take hold. But the digging stick, fragile and human-scaled, could not be harnessed to an ox or pulled across a field. It was not that kind of tool. And so, quietly, the limits of this ancient implement began to chafe against the growing ambitions of its makers, not because they sought progress in the way we think of it today, but because they were listening to the land, and the land was murmuring of deeper needs. The soil wanted turning, the crops wanted space. The body, weary and bent from repeated digging, longed for a way to ease its burden. In the margins of these early settlements, among the scattered huts and stone-lined hearths, someone, perhaps not even meaning to, shaped a new kind of tool. Still wood, still simple, but longer, with a crossbar, perhaps, to press with the foot, maybe with a little curve to better pry at the ground. It was not yet a plough, but it was something different, a suggestion, a leaning forward. In time, this suggestion would evolve. The stick would become a frame. The hand would be replaced by the pull of oxen. But the lessons learned with the digging stick, its intimacy, its failures, its relentless demands, would remain embedded in the shape of things to come. The plough, after all, would not erase the past. It would be born from it, slowly and quietly, one thoughtful scratch in the earth at a time. In the gentle unfolding of early agricultural history, where the days stretched long and the fields were still small enough to walk across in minutes, the hoe emerged as a quiet evolution of the digging stick. It did not arrive suddenly, nor did it demand attention. Rather, it appeared gradually, as the needs of farming outgrew the capabilities of what had come before. The hoe, at its simplest, was a flat blade attached at an angle to a handle, a practical response to an age-old problem. The digging stick had proved useful for making holes, but it lacked efficiency when it came to clearing weeds, breaking crusted soil, or turning the earth in preparation for planting. The hoe addressed these shortcomings with a wider edge and a different motion. Rather than pushing down, it was pulled or drawn towards the body, allowing the user to stand more upright, if only a little. These earliest hoes were made from materials readily at hand. The blades could be fashioned from stone, bone, or wood, chipped and shaped through slow, deliberate work. They were bound to wooden shafts using sinew, leather, or strips of fibre from bark or grasses. In wetter regions, where wood might rot more quickly, tools were often made anew each season. In drier climes, a single hoe might last through several harvests. The shift from stick to hoe was more than just mechanical. It changed the posture of the farmer, the rhythm of the work, and the scale of what could be achieved. A single person, with a sturdy hoe and a good stretch of time, could tend a plot of land large enough to feed a family. The tool expanded the footprint of agriculture, slightly, silently. Yet it was still deeply physical work. Farming with hoes meant bending, drawing, lifting. Fields were cleared in patches, the soil chopped and loosened inch by inch. In hotter climates, this often began in the cool of the morning, when the dew still clung to the grasses and birds stirred softly in the trees. A line of workers, perhaps family, perhaps neighbours, might move slowly together, side by side, their tools scraping and thudding in a steady rhythm. Children learned early how to handle a hoe. It was part of growing up, an unspoken inheritance. The weight of the tool, the way to angle the blade, the feel of good soil versus stubborn clay. All these things were passed down not through instruction, but through repetition. Farming was not taught so much as absorbed. As societies developed in different parts of the world, so too did variations of the hoe. In Africa, broad, flat hoes were used to work loamy soils. In parts of Asia, narrow, pointed hoes were better suited for the precise cultivation of rice paddies. In the Americas, hoes made from animal scapulae were tied to handles and used to cultivate maize. Each variation reflected a deep familiarity with the local landscape, a patient refinement born of need rather than invention. Even so, there were limits. The hoe allowed for greater productivity than the digging stick, but it was still bound by the strength and stamina of the human body. A day in the field left the arms sore, the back aching, the hands blistered. In dry soil, the blade might skip and clatter. In wet, it might clog with clumps of sticky earth. Weeds, once cleared, always returned, and without deeper tilling, the soil still tired over time. Land was cleared with great effort. Trees had to be felled, roots dug out, stones carted away. The hoe was indispensable in these labours, yet the scale of transformation remained small. Fields were modest, bounded often by natural features, streams, stones, patches of forest. There was no question yet of monoculture or industrial farming. Each patch of land had its own character, known intimately by those who worked it. The hoe was also a social tool. It brought people together in fields, in shared labour. Stories were told between swings of the blade. Songs were sung to keep time. In some cultures, communal farming days were followed by shared meals, rituals, or rest under shade trees. The hoe was not glamorous, but it was dependable. It shaped the daily rhythm of early farming life. There is something profoundly humbling about this phase of agricultural history. These were not machines in the modern sense. There were no gears, no engines, no sharp lines of design. The hoe was crude, but in its simplicity, it carried the full weight of human effort. It embodied what it meant to coax life from the land, to persist through heat and fatigue, to care for a patch of soil as both provider and place. And yet, beneath the surface, the desire for more ease was growing. The hoe, though useful, could not turn the deeper layers of soil. It could not break the earth in long, continuous lines. It could not be drawn by animals. As crops became more central to survival, as the climate shifted or the population increased, people once again began to imagine a better way. That imagining would lead, in time, to the first forms of the plough, but even as that new tool took shape, the hoe remained. It would not vanish. In many places, it never has. It remains even now in gardens and small fields, in allotments and kitchen plots, a humble echo of its ancient past. And so we leave this chapter not with a breakthrough, but with a pause. The hoe, like the people who wielded it, carried history not in leaps, but in steady, measured strokes. Elbow grease, patience, and soil beneath the fingernails, these were the true engines of early agriculture. In the long, slow tale of early agriculture, where change was measured not in years, but in lifetimes, the appearance of the Aard marked a subtle, yet momentous shift. Unlike the tools before it, those held in the hand and powered solely by human effort, the Aard introduced a new principle, that the earth might be parted not only by the body, but by something drawn through it, something that extended beyond the reach of one person. The Aard was not yet a plough, at least not in the way we understand the term today. It was rather a kind of scratching frame, a wooden beam with a pointed end, sometimes tipped with a harder material like bone, stone, or later metal, and attached at an angle to a simple frame. It did not turn the soil over, it did not cut deeply, it merely opened a line, a furrow, into which seed could be dropped. But in doing so, it multiplied what a person could achieve. Its origins are difficult to pinpoint precisely, as such early tools rarely survive the long passage of time. Wood rots, bindings decay, and the earth swallows its own history with remarkable efficiency. Yet traces appear here and there, figurines, carvings, marks in the soil, and later descriptions in texts or illustrations on pottery. The earliest examples are often associated with the Near East, particularly in regions where agriculture had taken early root: Mesopotamia, the Levant, parts of Anatolia. To imagine the first Aard, one must picture a simple wooden contraption, dragged by hand at first, by a farmer leaning forward, straining, coaxing the tool across a narrow field. The blade would part the soil in a shallow line, just deep enough for seed. It was, perhaps, no faster than hoeing, but it introduced a new kind of rhythm, one of walking rather than bending, of drawing rather than striking. Not long after, animals began to play a greater role. Cattle, already valued for milk, meat, and manure, were yoked and harnessed. The idea that their strength could be applied to field work was revolutionary, though it must have come slowly. The earliest harnesses were crude, often uncomfortable for the animals, and the mechanics of pulling were not yet fully understood. Yet, over time, improvements were made. Wooden yokes, leather straps, more balanced frames, and the ARD found its natural companion. With oxen at the fore, a single person could now cut furrows across an entire field. The transformation was not just physical, but psychological. The earth, once approached with the intimacy of hands and knees, now stretched out before the farmer like a canvas, long and linear, ready to be marked. Agriculture became less about the patch and more about the row. And still, the Aard remained humble. It could not handle stony ground or heavy clay. It worked best in sandy soils or in loam recently enriched by flood or ash. Its shallow reach meant that older roots and weeds often remained just below the surface, waiting to spring back. The tool required multiple passes in difficult areas, and it had to be followed by hand scattering of seed and sometimes by dragging branches or tools behind to cover the furrows. Yet its benefits were clear. Fields once prepared by many could now be managed by a few. The time between preparation and planting was shortened. The scale of cultivation expanded. More food meant more people, more settlement, more trade. And slowly, without fanfare, societies began to shift around the simple fact that more could be grown more regularly. The ard was a wonder not because of what it did, but because of what it made possible. It introduced the idea of assisted labour, of sharing the work between human and beast. It began to shape the land in new ways. Longer fields, straighter rows, more permanent boundaries. With its use came a different sense of time. The agricultural year grew more structured, with ploughing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting following a reliable sequence. In some regions, the ard was modified to suit local needs. In wetter areas, lighter frames helped reduce the strain on animals and prevent sinking into soft ground. In drier climates, blades were adjusted to cut through hard, sun-baked soil. Over centuries, these variations accumulated, giving rise to regional styles and preferences. But the core principle remained, a point drawn through the soil, not by hand, but by harnessed strength. There is a quiet dignity in the ard's simplicity. Unlike later ploughs, it did not dominate the field, it merely traced it. Its lines were not deep, but they were enough. Enough to carry seed, enough to suggest that farming might grow beyond the garden patch, that the land might give more with less aching of the back and less blistering of the hand. And so, in the soft light of early dawns, across countless forgotten valleys and sunlit plains, the wooden frame creaked forward, pulled by oxen, guided by calloused hands. It scratched the earth, not with violence, but with insistence. And the earth, as ever, responded in kind. In the slow march from foraging to farming, from wandering to settling, the Neolithic farmer occupied a space of quiet perseverance. Their days were long and full, measured not in hours, but in tasks, the sowing, the tending, the watching of skies. By the time the ard began to find its place among tools, these farmers were already well acquainted with the burden of coaxing life from the soil. Through seasons that changed not with ceremony, but with subtle, persistent shifts in wind and temperature. The Neolithic period, stretching from roughly 10,000 to 4,000 BCE in different parts of the world, was not a single moment of transformation, but rather a long transition, drawn out across centuries. It was here, in this murky stretch of prehistory, that farming became a way of life, and with it came a new intimacy with the land. Crops were no longer occasional supplements to a diet of wild foods. They were central, foundational, and so too was the work required to grow them. For the Neolithic farmer, the field was not a workplace so much as a lifeline. It was the measure of winter's survival, of children fed, of villages sustained. Preparing that field was a labour not only of physical strength, but of memory and hope. Stones were cleared, season after season, slowly accumulated into low boundary walls or forgotten in the corners of plots. Brush was cut back with fire and stick, and the soil, shallow in places, stubborn in others, was gradually made ready. The burden, of course, was not borne alone. In most early farming communities, the tasks were shared among family or village. Men, women, and children each played a part. There were no machines to substitute, no shortcuts. Every seed was placed, every weed pulled, every tool carried by hand. It was a communal rhythm, unhurried, repetitive grounding. The ard, in this context, offered more than mechanical assistance. It offered a way to ease the weight of daily toil, just slightly. A single pass of the tool could mark the ground for an entire row of planting, and when paired with oxen or another draft animal, it allowed for even greater expansion. A family might cultivate a larger plot without exhausting themselves, or help neighboring households in exchange for labor, food, or favor. The burden became more manageable, not because it disappeared, but because it was better shared. Still, the challenges remained many. The soil was capricious. In some places, it was rich and dark, easy to work. In others, it was thin and stony or prone to erosion. Rain was unpredictable. Too little, and crops failed. Too much, and they drowned or rotted in the field. Tools broke, animals sickened, and seeds sometimes did not sprout. The Neolithic farmer had no forecasts, no written guides, no manuals, only the experience of seasons past and the wisdom of elders. Storage, too, was a constant concern. Grain had to be protected from pests, mold, and theft. Clay jars, woven baskets, and stone-lined pits became essential technologies in their own right. Preserving the fruits of one's labor was just as vital as producing them. A single failed harvest could mean hunger, displacement, or worse. Despite these challenges, there was a quiet continuity to Neolithic life. The same tasks repeated across years with small variations. Planting followed ploughing, followed by weeding, followed by harvest. Tools were mended and reused. Fields were rotated or left fallow. Homes, often built of mud brick or wattle and daub, sat close to the land they served. There was no separation between domestic life and agricultural life. The field was an extension of the hearth, and vice versa. Religious or spiritual life often reflected this deep connection to the land. Rituals for planting and harvest, for rain and fertility, were common. Offerings might be made in the furrows or near the boundaries of fields. Deities of grain, sun, and earth appeared in early mythologies, not as distant figures, but as immediate presences, beings who shared in the burdens and blessings of the land. The art itself sometimes appeared in these rituals, treated not merely as a tool, but as something closer to a partner in the work of sustenance. Its wooden frame, worn smooth by seasons of use, might be passed down through generations. Repairs would be made lovingly, with care not only for function, but for form. In some cultures, the first use of the ard each season was a ceremonial act, marking the transition from rest to renewal. Women played a vital role in this world, not only in the field, but in the preservation and preparation of food. Grinding grain into flour, drying herbs, storing legumes, these were acts of skill and importance. Children watched and learned, not in schools, but by doing. Every member of the household was part of the agricultural cycle, bound together by the demands of land and season. And yet, for all its demands, Neolithic farming also allowed for a certain kind of rootedness. People stayed longer in one place, villages grew, paths were worn between fields, wells dug, boundaries marked with stones. The burden of farming was heavy, but it also gave rise to community, to shared memory, to the first hints of tradition. As the centuries passed, the ard would evolve, metal would appear, designs would shift, but the essential pattern, the scratch of tool against earth, the rhythm of seed and soil, the silent patience of the farmer would remain. And beneath it all, the enduring burden, not one of despair, but of quiet commitment, year after year, to the land that gave and took in equal measure. There is something deeply evocative in the image of an ox slowly pulling a wooden plough across a quiet field, the early light of dawn casting long shadows behind it. It is a scene as old as farming itself, a union not of speed or efficiency, but of endurance and patience. Long before the advent of engines or steel, it was the ox, paired with the humble yoke, that bore the weight of agriculture's growing ambitions. The relationship between humans and working animals was not always an obvious one. Early domestication efforts likely began with animals kept for meat or milk. But as farming expanded, it became clear that animals could offer something more than nourishment, strength. The ox, a castrated male of the cattle species, was particularly suited to this new role. Slower than horses, but stronger and more docile, oxen were ideal companions for the slow, repetitive tasks of early ploughing. The yoke, a wooden frame placed over the shoulders or neck of an animal, was the key that made this partnership possible. It distributed the load evenly, allowing the ox to push forward with its full strength without injury or discomfort. The earliest yokes were simple, often carved from a single piece of wood and tied in place with strips of hide or woven rope. Over time, more sophisticated forms developed. Double yokes for pairs of oxen, neck yokes in some regions, withers yokes in others, depending on the anatomy of the animals and local custom. For the farmer, the arrival of the yoke changed everything. Tasks that once demanded the efforts of many could now be accomplished by one or two, with the help of a patient beast. An ard drawn behind a pair of oxen could mark an entire field in the span of a morning, something that might have taken days with a hoe or digging stick. The pace was slow, the work still demanding, but the scale had changed. A new rhythm emerged in the fields, one guided not just by human hands, but by the steady clop of hooves and the creak of wood. Training an ox to pull a plough was no small task. It began early, often when the animal was still young. Patience was essential, as was gentleness. Harsh treatment led to resistance or injury. The farmer had to earn the ox's trust, guiding it through repeated walks, teaching it to respond to voice and touch. The process could take months, sometimes years, but once trained, a good team of oxen could serve faithfully for a decade or more, becoming as familiar as kin. In many early societies, the ox was valued not only for its utility, but for its temperament. Unlike donkeys or mules, oxen tended to be calm, consistent, and unflappable. They plodded forward through heat and cold, through fields flooded or parched, without complaint. Their strength was not dramatic, but deep, and they required less maintenance than horses, feeding mostly on grass and hay, needing less in the way of care. The use of oxen was not universal, of course. In some regions, particularly mountainous or heavily forested areas, other animals were preferred, or human labour remained dominant. But in wide, open plains, with fertile soil, the ox quickly became indispensable. From the Indus Valley to the Nile Delta, from the plains of Mesopotamia to the gentle slopes of the Mediterranean, oxen and yokes began to appear with increasing frequency in art, artifacts, and oral tradition. The bond between farmer and ox was often a quiet one. These were not pets, nor were they wild. They occupied a middle ground, a kind of working partnership rooted in mutual need. Farmers spoke to their oxen, sometimes sang to them, called them by name. They were fed before tools were cleaned, tended before tasks were finished. When an ox grew old or lame, its retirement was sometimes marked with a kind of reverence. Some were buried with care, others remembered in song or story. There were also limits to what even the strongest ox could do. Heavy soils required multiple passes. Rocky ground could dull the ard's tip or cause the yoke to jar painfully. The animals, though steady, could tire or fall ill. Diseases like foot and mouth, parasites, or infections of the hooves were known, even if not fully understood. A sick ox meant halted work, and a dead one could spell disaster. Yet, the presence of oxen also brought a kind of stability. Fields could be prepared more predictably. Surpluses became more common. With surplus came trade, and with trade, the growth of settlements into towns. The ox and the yoke unremarkable in their simplicity, laid the foundation for what would become complex, interdependent societies. In some early myths, oxen were said to have been given by the gods to help humanity. In others, they were seen as symbols of strength, patience, or fertility. Carvings from ancient Sumer, for example, often depict ploughing scenes, the oxen shown with careful detail, sometimes wearing plumes or adorned yokes for ritual occasions. In parts of Africa and Asia, ceremonial ploughing with oxen still takes place today, linking the present with a past that stretches back into the mists of the Neolithic. And so the ox plodded forward, step by step, drawing the humble ard across the field. The farmer followed close behind, one hand on the frame, eyes on the line, thoughts perhaps on the season to come. Together they traced the furrow, not with haste, but with certainty, not with brilliance, but with faith. In the long, unhurried arc of agricultural history, the arrival of metal was less a dramatic eruption and more a gradual reshaping, a deepening of possibility, a quiet reinforcement of tools long familiar. Wood had served its purpose faithfully, and in many ways it would continue to do so. But as human skill turned towards the smelting of ores, and as knowledge passed from one hearth to another, the hoe, the ard, and the handheld tools of farming began to take on new forms, edged not with stone or bone, but with bronze, and later iron. The earliest bronzes, an alloy of copper and tin, were a luxury at first. Shiny, resilient, and capable of taking a sharper edge than stone, bronze was expensive and difficult to produce. Tools made of it were treasured, often reserved for tasks of greatest importance or for the hands of the most skilled. But even in its rarity, bronze suggested something important, that farming might be not only preserved, but improved, that the burden of working the soil might be lessened, even slightly, by the clever use of better materials. The ard, with its simple frame and pointed tip, was among the first to benefit. Replacing its wooden or stone point with a bronze fitting allowed for deeper, more reliable cuts into the earth. Fields with heavier soil, those once avoided or worked with great difficulty, could now be brought under cultivation. A bronze-tipped ard sliced more easily through clumps and root systems, lasting longer and requiring fewer repairs. This did not mean that metal transformed the fields overnight. Bronze was still rare, and each piece had to be carefully cast, shaped, and fitted. A broken tool might take weeks to replace. But as trade routes expanded and knowledge of metallurgy spread, bronze became more accessible. In regions like Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Eastern Mediterranean, bronze tools began to appear with growing regularity, not replacing wooden implements entirely, but supplementing them, strengthening them, offering a quiet promise of durability. Then came iron, unlike bronze, which required the blending of two metals in careful proportions. Iron was more abundant and more widely scattered across the earth. It was harder to work at first. The temperatures needed to smelt and shape it were higher, and the processes more demanding. But once mastered, iron became the farmer's silent ally. An iron tip on a ploughshare could withstand far more wear than one of bronze. It could break through tougher soils, turn over hardened fields, and endure longer hours of work with fewer interruptions. With iron tools, the size of cultivable land increased once again. What had once been marginal, clay-heavy ground, plots strewn with small stones, became viable. The effects were incremental but profound. More reliable ploughing meant more dependable planting. This, in turn, allowed for better planning, more sophisticated crop rotation, and the possibility of surplus. Surplus meant storage, and storage meant stability. A community with enough food could begin to think beyond mere subsistence. towards craft, trade, even governance. It is tempting to speak of the Bronze Age and Iron Age as grand epochs of transformation marked by warfare and empire. But for the farmer, the changes were more intimate. The difference lay in the feel of a tool in the hand, in the smoothness of its cut, in the ease with which it moved through soil long known for its resistance. These were revolutions of touch and effort, not spectacle. Iron also allowed for the making of new tools entirely. The coulter, for example, a vertical blade fitted ahead of the ploughshare to slice through the soil before the main blade followed, began to appear in some regions. This innovation allowed for cleaner, more consistent furrows. Metal scythes, sickles and spades likewise began to replace their older counterparts, increasing the speed and efficiency of harvesting, digging and clearing. Yet even as these metal tools spread, they remained tied to the rhythms of the field. A better blade did not eliminate the need to rise early, to watch the weather, to feel the soil between one's fingers, and know whether it was ready. Technology in this quiet era did not overpower nature. It worked alongside it, humbly, steadily, in service of life. There were, of course, setbacks. Iron tools required maintenance. They rusted if left damp, dulled if struck against stone. Blacksmiths became vital members of any farming community, their forges filled not just with weapons, but with the quiet necessities of the field. A well-made ploughshare was as prized as a sword, and perhaps more valuable in the long run. And so the plough, once a simple wooden frame dragged across sun-baked earth, now carried within it the glint of metal. Its voice, once a creak of timber, now rang with the occasional clink of iron against stone. Still pulled by oxen, still guided by hands worn and weathered, it marked the soil with a deeper certainty. The Bronze and Iron Ages did not sweep away the past. They built upon it. They strengthened the old tools, gave form to quiet ambitions, and allowed the farmer to walk a little farther, to plough a little deeper, to hope a little more securely. Beneath the arc of the Fertile Crescent, where rivers wandered through flat plains and left behind their silty gifts, the land of Sumer rose slowly from the dust. It was not a land of forests or hills, but of wide, open fields, of sun-baked expanses and occasional floods, where the earth cracked in summer and softened under springtime rains. And it was here, in the southern reaches of ancient Mesopotamia, that the plough found one of its earliest and most enduring homes. Sumerian civilization was never far from its fields. The cities, Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, emerged not apart from agriculture, but as its consequence. Their temples, ziggurats, and clay-walled dwellings were built upon the foundation of barley, emmer wheat, and legumes, grown in long, narrow plots beside the shifting waters of the Tigris and Euphrates. The land was generous if carefully managed, but it asked for planning, for patience, for tools. And so, amid the rise of writing and cities, of law and trade, the Sumerians refined the art of tilling the earth. The plough became more than a tool. It became a fixture of culture, of religion, even of bureaucracy. Clay tablets from as early as 3000 BCE describe ploughing techniques, land allotments, field measurements, and tool inventories. Farmers were not simply left to their own devices. They were part of a larger, measured system in which labour, output, and land use were carefully recorded. The Sumerian plough, known from artifacts and illustrations, was a wooden frame drawn by oxen, tipped with a metal or hardened wood point. Some versions included a seed funnel, a narrow tube through which grain could be dropped directly into the furrow as it was cut. This innovation, though simple, saved time and effort, combining two tasks into one and ensuring a more even distribution of seed. Fields in Sumer were typically long and rectangular, laid out in a manner suited to irrigation. Canals branched off the main rivers, feeding water into ditches that ran alongside the fields. Water was directed carefully. Too much could ruin the soil, too little and the crop failed. The plough worked in tandem with this system. Furrows could help guide water. Raised ridges separated plots. The act of ploughing, once seasonal and informal, became part of a broader choreography of flood, flow, and harvest. And yet, the life of a Sumerian farmer was no easier than that of their Neolithic ancestors. The sun was harsh, the summers long and dry. The soil, though rich, could become salinized over time from repeated irrigation. Tools wore out. Oxen grew old. The land required constant tending. But the tools, now stronger and more effective, helped extend what could be done. In Sumer, farming was also deeply ritualistic. The plough itself featured in religious texts and temple offerings. The god Enlil, associated with air, wind, and creation, was sometimes linked to agricultural prosperity. Hymns from the era mention the plough in reverent tones, its cutting of the earth as a sacred act, its role in sustaining life as noble and necessary. There are even fragments of early poetry that describe the plough being fashioned by the gods, then gifted to humanity as a token of favour. Labour was communal and often managed by the temple estates. Fields were allocated according to need or status, and overseers ensured that ploughing, sowing, and harvesting occurred on schedule. Slaves, hired workers, and family members worked side by side, their efforts woven into the economic and spiritual fabric of the city. The plough, for all its plainness, moved at the heart of these rhythms. It is worth pausing for a moment to imagine the scene. A team of oxen, harnessed in a simple wooden yoke, pulling the plough across a field, soft from winter rains. Behind them, a farmer guiding the frame, eyes on the line, hands steady. Perhaps a second person walks beside, dropping seed into the open furrow. Beyond the field, the canal gurgles softly. The walls of a city shimmer in the distance, their mud brick outlines hazy in the sun. The ziggurat rises like a great stair, and from within it priests chant invocations for rain and plenty. In Sumer, the land was not only worked, it was organized, recorded, mythologized. The plough became more than a tool, it was a symbol of civil order. It marked the land not only for seed, but for ownership, for taxation, for divine favor. A ploughed field was a promise. That work had been done, that food would come, that life could continue. And even as cities rose and wars were waged, as kings issued decrees and scribes etched contracts into clay, the plough continued its steady path. It did not change much in form, but it endured. Pulled by beasts, guided by hands, it remained rooted in the slow certainty of soil and season. The Sumerians passed much on to those who followed, writing, law, stories, astronomy. But among their quieter gifts was this refined, enduring partnership between human and land, beast and tool. A way of working the earth that, in many places, remains visible even now, beneath the sun, beneath the dust, beneath the slow turning of history. To stand by the Nile in ancient times was to witness the turning of a grand, reliable wheel. Each year, without fail, the river would swell with the monsoon rains from far-off highlands, spilling over its banks and blanketing the floodplain with rich, dark silt. This annual inundation was not feared. It was welcomed. For the people of ancient Egypt, it was not a disaster, but a gift, as regular as the rising sun and as vital as breath. And in the hush that followed the receding waters, when the earth was soft and black and ready, the plough would enter the scene. Egyptian agriculture was shaped in every way by this rhythm. Time itself was divided according to the river's behavior. The year had 3 seasons: Akhet, the flood; Pere, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest. Ploughing began during Pere, when the flood waters had drained away and the land could once again be walked upon, worked upon, and coaxed into fertility. The Egyptian plough, or mister, as it may have been known, bore resemblance to the simple ard used in other ancient societies: a wooden frame with a pointed tip, sometimes with a crosspiece for a handle, drawn by oxen. It scratched shallow furrows into the silt, just deep enough for seed. The ploughshare, often a mere hardened wooden wedge, could be tipped with copper or bronze in later periods, but even when unshod, it performed admirably in the soft, forgiving soil left by the flood. Farmers worked in pairs or small groups. One or two would guide the plough, keeping it true along the line, while another might lead the oxen or scatter the seed. Fields were often long and narrow, bordered by raised earthen ridges that helped manage irrigation and marked the boundaries between plots. These ridges were carefully maintained, their lines passed down through generations, along with knowledge of water flow, soil depth, and the temperament of beasts. The Nile Valley was not an easy place, exactly, but it was a consistent one. There were few surprises. The sun was ever present, the rains fell far to the south, and the land, replenished each year by the river's silt, asked for less in the way of manure or rotation than fields elsewhere. Crops included barley, emmer wheat, flax, lentils, and onions, plants well suited to the cycle of inundation and drought. The plough's role in this system was modest but essential. It did not revolutionize the land, it prepared it respectfully, gently. Unlike in more arid or stony regions, Egyptian soil needed only a nudge, a line drawn here, a furrow cut there, and the work was guided as much by tradition as by technique. One did not rush. The plough moved slowly, deliberately, its handlers keeping pace with the oxen, who in turn seemed to sense the calm of the task. There are scenes of this life carved into stone, painted on tomb walls, inscribed in papyri. They show farmers behind ploughs, bending slightly, their linen kilts loose and dusty. Oxen with curved horns and painted hides lean into the yoke, their heads low. The fields stretch out under a flat sky, and in the distance, the familiar silhouette of palm and reed, the slow shimmer of the river. These images were not decorative. They were honorific. Farming, and ploughing in particular, was sacred labor. To the ancient Egyptians, the act of tilling the soil mirrored cosmic order. Just as the gods had brought form out of chaos, so too did the farmer draw order from the earth, furrow by furrow, seed by seed. The god Osiris, associated with death and rebirth, was often symbolized by grain sprouting from the soil. The cutting of the furrow was, in a sense, a reenactment of creation. The land opened, the seed received, the harvest awaited. Tools were simple, but their making and maintenance were thoughtful. A plough had to be balanced properly, its frame joined with care, its shaft smooth enough not to splinter. The yoke had to fit the oxen well. Too loose and it would chafe, too tight and it would hinder movement. Ropes, sometimes made from flax or palm fibre, held the assembly together, tightened and adjusted as needed. When not in use, ploughs were stored in sheds or leaned against walls, their wood darkened by sun and hand. Labourers on these farms were varied. Some were family members, some servants, some workers hired for the season. In the estates of temples or the holdings of the elite, overseers kept careful records. Grain was measured, output tallied, and taxes assessed. Yet even within this bureaucratic system, the plough retained its simplicity. It remained a thing of lines and loops, of motion and soil. It moved quietly through the field, its task unchanged across reigns and dynasties. The Nile itself seemed to bless the effort. Water channels ran beside the ploughed fields, feeding the furrows or waiting for the next round of planting. After the plough passed, seed was scattered by hand, then covered with a brush or harrow. Birds came swiftly, pecking at the exposed grains. Scarecrows, slings, and children with sticks kept them at bay. And still the work continued, measured, patient, sustained. As the day waned, the farmer would lean on the plough, wiping sweat from brow, watching the light stretch across the furrows. The oxen would rest under a fig tree or beside a clay trough. The work, though unfinished, had moved forward, and in that slow progress was a kind of peace. Even now, in parts of Egypt where the river still floods and the fields still breathe with the rhythm of ancient waters, ploughs not unlike those of the pharaohs are drawn across the land. Their frames may be reinforced, their yokes padded, but the act itself remains unchanged. A line drawn in the soil, a gesture of hope, a trust in the earth to give again what it has always given, quietly, steadily, in time. As the ancient world widened, and as ideas, tools, and customs crossed seas and mountain passes, the plough found new soil to work. In the lands of Greece and Rome, where olive trees bent in dry winds and vineyards clung to stony hills, the agricultural life was never far from thought. It shaped economies, philosophies, and daily rhythms. And amid the many artifacts of these civilizations, the statues, coins, epics, and laws, the plough continued its quiet, enduring labor. In Greece, the land itself posed challenges. Much of the terrain was mountainous or hilly, with narrow valleys and uneven soil. Large-scale farming, as seen in Mesopotamia or Egypt, was difficult in many regions. Yet the Greeks made do, adapting their methods to the contours of the landscape. Terracing was used to catch and hold water, and small plots were carefully managed. The plough here was often a modest tool, simple, wooden, and drawn by oxen or sometimes donkeys. Greek ploughs followed the Ard tradition, but with refinements. One notable type was the autogos, a one-piece plough made from a naturally forked tree branch. The longer arm served as the shaft, the shorter as the handle, and the third branch as the share. This elegant solution required careful selection of wood and a trained eye, but once made, it was sturdy and effective. Another type, the pecten, was assembled from separate parts and could be repaired more easily. Writers like Hesiod, in his didactic poem Works and Days, gave detailed advice on plough construction and use. He urged the farmer to have 2 ploughs, one in use, one as a spare, and spoke of the right time to sow, the behaviour of oxen, and the moral worth of steady labour. For Hesiod, the plough was not just a tool, it was a symbol of diligence, a way to align oneself with the cycles of nature and the favour of the gods. In Greek thought, agriculture held a certain nobility. The farmer, bound to the land and dependent on its rhythms, was seen as virtuous, closer to the old ways, to self-sufficiency, and to the values of moderation and patience. This reverence for farming endured even as cities grew and trade expanded. The plough remained a quiet presence, respected though rarely glorified. Across the Ionian Sea, the Romans inherited and expanded upon these traditions. With their vast territories and growing populations, they required more systematic approaches to agriculture. Roman farming was both practical and ambitious, and the plough played a central role in its methods. The Roman plough, or aratrum, evolved into a more complex and effective tool. Though still wooden in its main structure, it often featured an iron-tipped share and a coulter. a vertical knife-like blade fitted ahead of the share to cut the soil vertically before the share turned it. This allowed for more thorough tilling, particularly in heavier soils. The aratrum could be adjusted for depth and angle, making it versatile across different terrains. Oxen remained the primary draft animals, though mules and horses were sometimes used as well. Roman yokes were typically fastened across the neck or shoulders, with iron or wooden collars. The animals were trained carefully, and ploughmen, aratores, held a respected place in rural life. Roman writers, too, spoke of ploughing. Cato the Elder, in his De Agri Cultura, offered practical advice on managing farms and selecting tools. Varro and Columella wrote treatises that combined observation with philosophy, covering everything from crop rotation to soil care. Virgil, in his Georgics, gave the subject a more poetic treatment, weaving descriptions of ploughing into a broader meditation on labour, loss, and nature's cycles. In Roman society, the land was deeply tied to identity and status. The agricola, farmer, was the backbone of the republic, at least in principle. Military service, citizenship, and voting rights were often linked to land ownership. The act of ploughing one's own field was thus not only economic, but political, even moral. It spoke of self-reliance, discipline, and civic virtue. But the reality was not always so simple. As Rome expanded, large estates, latifundia, grew in prominence, often worked by enslaved labour and managed by overseers. The plough, once guided by the farmer's own hand, was now in the grip of another. Fields stretched farther, yields increased, but the personal connection between plough and ploughman began to wane. Still, the tool itself remained essentially the same. The aratrum pulled steadily through the fields of Italy, Gaul, Hispania, and beyond, continued to open the soil as it had for centuries. In spring, it scratched the surface to receive seed. In summer, it rested. In autumn, it might be used again to break stubble and prepare for the next cycle. Its voice, a soft creak, the thud of share against root, the rhythmic snort of the ox, was a constant across provinces and generations. The symbolism of the plough endured in Roman ceremony and story. The founding of new cities often began with a ritual ploughing of a boundary. Ploughing was invoked in oaths and curses, in myths of origin and poems of longing. Even as urban life flourished, the image of the ploughman remained, distant perhaps, but respected. And so in Greece and Rome alike, the plough held its place, not central but essential. Its lines traced not only fields, but values, patience, labour, belonging. Whether in the terraced valleys of Attica or the broad estates of Latium, it moved forward, quietly and steadily, cutting furrows through the soil and the story of civilization itself. Far to the east, where rivers ran long and civilizations traced their roots through dynasties and sages, the plough evolved in a way both distinct and profound. In ancient China, amid the gently undulating fields and low plains, a remarkable refinement emerged, one that would shape not only the soil, but the future of agriculture itself. The Chinese moldboard plough, centuries ahead of its time, brought with it a quiet revolution in how land was worked and understood. Chinese farming traditions stretched back millennia, shaped by the rhythms of the Yellow River and the Yangtze, by monsoon rains and seasonal floods. The soil was often rich, but could be dense or heavy, demanding more than the simple scratch of an ard. And so, through long observation and slow, thoughtful craft, the Chinese plough was transformed. As early as the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century BCE, records describe ploughs with iron shares and curved moldboards, an innovation not yet seen in much of the Western world. where the ard simply opened a furrow, leaving the soil to fall as it might. The mouldboard plough lifted and turned it. This subtle twist, a curvature of the plough's body, meant that the soil was not only parted, but flipped neatly to one side, burying weeds, aerating the earth, and preparing a finer seedbed. The effect was transformative. Fields could be ploughed more thoroughly with fewer passes. The labour of weeding was reduced. Moisture retention improved as the turned soil covered the softer layers beneath. For crops like rice, wheat, and millet, mainstays of Chinese agriculture, this meant steadier yields, healthier growth, and more reliable harvests. Crafted most often from wood with an iron share fixed to the base and a smooth, curved mouldboard rising behind it, these ploughs were typically drawn by oxen or water buffalo. The design varied by region, adapted for paddy fields in the south, for drier uplands in the north, but the principle remained. A human, walking behind, guided the tool with a steady hand, while the animal ahead pulled in its measured, rhythmic way. What made the Chinese approach so distinct was not only the plough itself, but the systematic way it was studied, improved, and disseminated. Agricultural texts from the Eastern Han period and beyond, most notably the works of Fan Shengji and later Jia Sixi's Qimin Yaoshu, included detailed illustrations and instructions. They explained not just how to use the plough, but how to build and maintain it, how to train the animals, how to plough according to soil type and season. This careful attention to detail, this blend of craft and philosophy, was characteristic of Chinese agricultural thought. Farming was not seen as menial, but as vital and worthy of study. The farmer, like the scholar or physician, was engaged in a practice of balance between land and labour, between tool and hand. Even in the imperial bureaucracy, agriculture held high status. Local officials were expected to promote efficient farming, to oversee irrigation, and to ensure that ploughs were available to those in need. In some dynasties, state-sponsored workshops produced ploughshares and other implements which could be distributed or sold at low cost. The goal was not only productivity, but stability, an agricultural foundation broad enough to support the complexities of empire. Ploughing in China was thus not merely a private act, but a public concern. Fields were tended not in isolation, but in networks. Families working beside neighbours, communities linked by dikes and ditches, canals and causeways. And at the heart of this quiet industry, the plough moved slowly, methodically, shaping not just the soil, but the structure of rural life. It is a soothing image to hold. An early morning in the lowlands, the mist still clinging to the grass, a farmer walking barefoot through the moist earth. The buffalo lumbers forward, muscles moving beneath a dark hide, the wooden plough creaking softly behind. With each step, the mouldboard rolls the soil, a neat ribbon of earth turned to the side, steam rising gently in the cool air. Children might watch from the embankments. Elderly relatives, sitting on woven stools, could be seen mending baskets or sharpening blades. The village beyond, quiet and low-slung, begins to stir with the sound of birds and the clink of pots. It is a world without hurry, bound to the progress of the plough, to the needs of seedlings not yet visible. In time, the Chinese mouldboard plough would travel, its influence reaching Korea, Japan, and, much later, through the Arab world and into Europe. But for centuries, it remained a local marvel, quietly improving the lives of millions, one furrow at a time. Its significance lies not only in its design, but in its ethos. It reflects a world where progress was not always loud, where invention served the humble task of feeding others, and where the turning of soil could be seen as a gesture of care. And so, across the long fields of ancient China, where the rivers ran slow and the seasons turned in their familiar arc, the plough moved steadily. Not fast, not flashy, but certain. It worked with the land, not against it. And in doing so, it helped shape one of the world's most enduring civilizations from the roots up. With the turning of the first millennium, as Europe entered its long medieval centuries, the plough underwent another quiet transformation. Though simple adze had served well across lighter soils, the landscapes of northern and western Europe presented a different challenge altogether. Clay-rich, heavy earth that clung tightly to itself and resisted even the most persistent scratching. Here, in these damp and weighty fields, the old tools faltered, and so, out of necessity rather than ambition, the heavy plough was born. The heavy plough, also known as the moldboard plough in the Western tradition, was not a sudden invention, but the culmination of slow improvement, region by region. Unlike its lighter predecessors, it was designed to turn soil rather than merely open it. It combined several elements: a coulter, which sliced vertically, a share, which cut horizontally beneath the surface, and a moldboard, which lifted and rolled the soil to one side, burying weeds and crop residue in the process. This threefold action was ideally suited to the dense soils of the north. The heavy plough cut deep, creating a clean furrow and a ridged field. It allowed for more consistent planting, better drainage, and improved soil aeration. Its introduction was most notable in the lands that now make up France, Germany, the Low Countries, and parts of Britain, regions where heavier, wetter soils had previously constrained cultivation. Yet the heavy plough was, as its name suggests, demanding. Its frame, often of oak, required strong draft power, teams of oxen, or eventually horses with specialized harnesses. It was not a tool for the lone farmer. Its size and strength called for cooperation, for shared ownership or communal ploughing days, and so it helped to reinforce one of the central patterns of medieval rural life, the open field system. This system, with its characteristic strip farming, spread widely across Europe. Instead of owning large enclosed fields, peasants held rights to scattered strips, narrow plots spread out across wider communal fields. The arrangement allowed for equitable access to good and poor land alike, and helped to ensure that everyone participated in both the labour and the yield. Fields were divided into long, thin strips for a reason. The heavy plough, with its tendency to turn soil in one direction, worked best when ploughing in straight lines, back and forth. The strips, often about a furlong long, roughly 220 yards, the distance a team could plough before resting, reflected the working rhythm of the plough itself. Over time, these patterns etched themselves into the very layout of the countryside, with ridge and furrow topography still visible in some places today. Life for the medieval ploughman was shaped by this rhythm. The year began not in January, but in the slow thaw of spring, when frost released the soil and the first preparations could begin. Fields were rotated, typically on a 2 or 3 field system, to preserve fertility. 1 year for grain, 1 for legumes or other crops, 1 left fallow. The plough marked each phase, cutting fresh furrows as the seasons turned. The work was slow and physical, harnessing the oxen, guiding the plough through uneven terrain, clearing stones and roots. Each required effort and attention. A slip in the furrow could mean a broken share or a strained yoke. And yet there was also satisfaction in the straight line, in the regularity of the cut, in the knowledge that beneath the upturned earth lay the promise of sustenance. In villages, plough teams were often shared. A poorer peasant might contribute animals or labour in exchange for time with the plough. The lord of the manor, or his reeve, might coordinate the use of common tools. Sometimes a single plough was used by the entire community, moving from strip to strip as the days unfolded. These arrangements, though informal, created a kind of interdependence, an unspoken network of cooperation, anchored by the quiet progress of the plough. Religious life, too, was interwoven with agricultural rhythms. Ploughing might be blessed by the parish priest. Saints' days were observed as rest days or markers for particular tasks. The first ploughing of the year might be accompanied by prayer or procession. In some parts of England and northern Europe, Plough Monday marked the symbolic return to fieldwork after the Christmas season. Villagers would decorate a plough and parade it through the streets, collecting offerings or food before beginning the year's labour. The heavy plough also carried metaphorical weight. In sermons and poetry, the furrow became a symbol of effort, of discipline, of moral cultivation. The ploughman was often depicted as honest, diligent, and close to the divine order of creation. In Piers Plowman, the 14th century English allegory, the titular character represents not just a farmer, but a kind of spiritual ideal, a figure of humility, virtue, and constancy. As the centuries wore on, the plough remained steady. Innovations came slowly, a better iron share here, a more efficient harness there, but the essential form endured. Even as windmills rose and towns grew, the heavy plough continued to pass through the fields each season, its deep cuts preparing the earth for seed and harvest alike. In this long, stable period of European history, the plough was not the engine of dramatic change, but the anchor of continuity. It marked the land, yes, but also the passage of time, the sharing of labour, and the connection between people and place. It was drawn not just through soil, but through memory, its furrows a kind of script in the earth, written slowly, rewritten each year, and read by all who lived upon it. As the centuries passed, the plough remained a quiet companion to human civilization, its form gently evolving, its purpose unchanged. Through wars and plagues, renaissances and reformations, the furrow continued to trace its slow course through field and season. New rulers rose, new faiths spread, new lands were charted, but the plough, that old wooden guide, still moved steadily forward, pulled by beast or hand, always toward the next planting. By the later Middle Ages and into the early modern period, ploughs became more regional in their variation, shaped not only by the land they worked, but by the customs of the people who wielded them. In the Low Countries, with their damp, peaty soils, broad-wheeled ploughs spread the weight of the frame, preventing it from sinking. In parts of Scotland, the short, rough plots demanded lighter ploughs that could be turned easily. In Spain and southern Italy, where summers were long and the earth baked hard, farmers adapted their methods to the rhythm of drought and dew. These differences mattered. They were not simply matters of preference, but of long acquaintance with the land. A village's plough design was a distillation of generations of listening to the soil, to the weather, to the pull of oxen along a particular slope. The way a share was shaped, the kind of wood used for the beam, the manner of yoking the animals, all were expressions of accumulated knowledge, handed down not in books, but in gestures, in habit, in muscle memory. And still, at heart, the plough's task remained the same: to open the soil, to prepare, to begin. It did not guarantee harvest, it did not prevent failure, but it set the stage. In this period, the growth of towns and trade began to affect rural life more visibly. Iron became more available, and blacksmiths were more commonly found in even small villages. With this came the opportunity to reinforce ploughs with metal parts, not only the share and coulter, but the fittings, bolts, and braces. A well-made plough could now last longer, cut deeper, and withstand more strain. yet the rhythm of work remained steady. In many parts of Europe, the same fields were ploughed year after year, sometimes for centuries. Land passed from parent to child, from tenant to tenant, and with the land came the knowledge of it, the knowledge of where the soil grew stony, where it held water too long, where the weeds took root if one delayed the turning by a week. Ploughing was seasonal, but within each season it held its own quiet rituals. The animals had to be shod, the harness checked for wear, the blades sharpened. These were not dramatic tasks, but they formed the architecture of daily life. Before breakfast, a ploughman might walk the length of his strip, testing the soil with his boot, watching the sky. And when he took up the handles and called to the oxen, he did not expect surprise. He expected only that today would be much like yesterday, a little forward, a little strain, a little progress. There was comfort in this. In an age when much else was uncertain, prices, politics, health, the plough offered a kind of constancy. It answered only to the soil and the season. In some places, old customs lingered. It was common, in parts of England and Scandinavia, to keep a handful of unploughed turf in each field, plough corners left for the spirits of the land. These untouched patches were rarely large, but they spoke of a world view in which the land was not wholly owned or used, but shared. In Brittany and Galicia, old songs accompanied the start of the ploughing season, their verses half remembered but always sung. Elsewhere, folklore attached itself to the furrow. Dreams of straight furrows were said to portend steady fortune. A crooked furrow, cut carelessly or in haste, might draw gossip or scorn. A well-ploughed field, smooth and even in its ridges, spoke of good character as much as good farming. The skill of the ploughman lay not only in strength, but in his ability to read the land, to guide without forcing, to pace the work so that the team did not tire before noon. In colder climates, the plough sometimes had to wait until the frost lifted. But in mild years, the first ploughing might begin in late winter, even as the trees stood bare and the fields still wore their frost-bitten hues. The sight of the first turned soil, dark, damp, alive with promise, was a quiet moment of hope. It was not celebrated with trumpet or bell, but with a glance between neighbours, a nod across the furrow, an unspoken agreement that the year had begun. This continuity extended beyond Europe. Across Eurasia, parts of Africa, and the edges of the Middle East, local versions of the plough persisted, each suited to its soil, each moving at the pace of the people who used it. In India, the Nagali was drawn by bullocks across the cracked red soil of the Deccan. In Japan, ploughs guided by hand or beast worked the flooded rice paddies in measured arcs. In the Andean highlands, foot ploughs continued to turn terraces that no wheeled implement could reach. And in all these places, the act was familiar, a line in the soil, a gesture of readiness. The earth, disturbed and yet not harmed, opening once again to the cycle of seed and season. As the centuries wore on and the whispers of new machines began to stir, the old plough still held its place, not as an object of invention, but as a quiet tradition. It spoke not of innovation, but of memory, of land passed down, of care taken again and again with each passing year. By the time the 18th century drew near, a slow but steady change was beginning to take hold across the fields of Europe. The agricultural revolution, as it would come to be called, was not a single invention nor a sudden shift, but rather a series of cumulative improvements, techniques, tools, and understandings that, when taken together, gently rewrote the old rhythms of farming. And at the quiet centre of this transformation, still plodding patiently behind its team, the plough found itself reshaped once more, this time by steel. It began, as such things often do, with small adjustments. Agricultural reformers in Britain, the Low Countries, and beyond began to look closely at the old practices. They studied soil, tested crop rotations, and re-evaluated the tools of the field. The plough, long accepted as a fixed part of the farming world, came under new scrutiny. Was the angle of the mouldboard correct? Could the share be made to cut more cleanly? Might a lighter frame, or one with interchangeable parts, make the work more efficient? Tinkering led to design, and design to invention. In Britain, the Rotherham plough of 1730 marked one of the earliest known departures from the all-wooden frame. It featured an iron blade and a more efficient, curved mouldboard, carefully shaped to turn the soil with less drag. This, combined with a lighter frame, meant that fewer draft animals were needed and that ploughing could be done more quickly and with less effort. The improvements were modest, but cumulative. Better tools meant more ground could be worked. More ground meant more crops, and more crops, along with the adoption of techniques like crop rotation, selective breeding, and improved drainage, meant more food. Surpluses grew, populations rose, and in the quiet shadows of the field, the plough was doing its part, as ever. Then, in the early 19th century, came the next great refinement, the steel plough. In the American Midwest, where the soil was rich with organic matter and heavy with clay, wooden and iron ploughs often faltered. The earth clung to the blade, clogging the furrow and forcing frequent stops to scrape it clean. Farmers grumbled and fields went half-turned. But in 1837, a blacksmith named John Deere fashioned a plough from a polished steel saw blade. His design, curved and shining, sliced through the prairie sod with ease. The soil did not stick. The furrow turned cleanly, and the farmer, for the first time, could move steadily across ground that had previously defied him. Deere's plough was not the first use of steel in farming, but it was among the first to succeed commercially. His innovation spread quickly, especially as westward expansion brought more and more settlers into contact with the thick, untamed earth. The steel plough marked a shift, not only in materials, but in mindset. It was the beginning of mass-manufactured farming tools, of standardized parts and interchangeable fittings. Blacksmiths gave way to factories. Repair became replacement. And though the farmer still walked behind the plough or rode upon it, the tool itself was no longer shaped by hand or passed down from father to son. It came boxed, shipped, catalogued. And yet, for all its sharpness and polish, the steel plough still required the same patient effort. It still needed guiding hands and strong animals, or, increasingly, steam power. In the latter half of the 19th century, the steam engine made its cautious entrance into farming. At first, it was cumbersome, expensive, and prone to breakdown, but gradually it too found its rhythm. The steam plough, drawn by great machines or fixed to pulley systems across a field, began to replace the slower tread of ox and horse. This shift was not without resistance. Many farmers preferred the old ways, the sound of hooves, the familiar creak of timber and iron, the steady partnership between man and beast. The steam engine was noisy, smelly, and impersonal, but it was efficient, and in time, efficiency won out. The agricultural revolution did not abolish the past, it layered upon it. Even as new tools emerged, older methods lingered. In remote valleys, on small holdings, in fields where machines could not reach, the old plough remained in use. Oxen still pulled, hands still guided, but around them the world was quickening. New crops, new markets, new demands. Grain that once fed only a village now travelled by rail and steamship. Farming, once a local craft, was becoming a national enterprise. The plough, steady and slow, was pulled into this new order, not as relic, but as foundation. By the end of the 19th century, ploughs were being forged in great numbers, their blades tempered in fire, their shares stamped with makers' marks. Some had multiple blades for deeper cuts, others were designed to attach to mechanical tractors. The once simple frame of wood and rope had become a complex modular instrument, still recognizable in form, but utterly changed in scale. And through all of this, the task remained the same. The plough turned the soil. It prepared the earth. It made ready the ground for another season. In fields both ancient and new, it traced the furrow, sometimes with smoke and clatter, sometimes with silence and care. The agricultural revolution did not erase the old world. It refined it, sharpened it, plated it in steel. But beneath that steel was still the soil, and above it still the sky, and in between, always, the ploughman, guiding, adjusting, waiting for the seed. In the hush of early morning, with dew clinging to the grass and the first light brushing the tops of hedgerows, the plough stands waiting, still, quiet, familiar, its handles worn smooth by years of touch, its blade dulled and sharpened and dulled again. It has waited like this for thousands of years. It has watched generations come and go. It has known hands hardened by labour, backs bent not in defeat but in devotion. And as we come to the end of our long, slow journey through its story, we may pause here beside it and consider what it has quietly done. The plough is not a thing that shouts for attention. It has never been an instrument of spectacle. It does not glitter in museums, nor stand atop monuments. It is not named in declarations or held aloft in paintings. And yet, it has shaped the very fabric of civilization. With it, humans learned not only to survive, but to settle, to sow with intention, to plan for futures that stretched beyond the next hunt, the next fire, the next moon. It carved the lines that would become fields, which became farms, which became villages and towns. It taught us to wait, to watch the weather, to read the soil, to trust the unseen life hidden beneath the surface. It joined us to animals, not as hunters, but as partners. It taught patience, routine, and the value of quiet return. Wherever it travelled, the plough left more than furrows. It left customs, rituals, proverbs. It shaped calendars. It appeared in the earliest glyphs and scripts, sometimes as symbol, sometimes as prayer. In its path grew not just food, but community, people gathered by the promise of a shared harvest, a shared labour, a shared rhythm of life. In hard times, the plough was not abandoned, but returned to. In war, it was laid aside but never forgotten, and in peace, it was picked up again, not with fanfare, but with relief, its weight familiar, its purpose clear. It has known many forms: digging stick, hoe, ard, mouldboard, steel share. It has been pulled by hand, by ox, by horse, by steam, and by diesel. It has creaked across clay and loam, across mountain terrace and prairie plain. It has cut the dry crust of the Sahel and slipped gently through the silt of the Nile. It has written the same line over and over again in 1,000 dialects of soil. And though the world has changed beyond measure, and though modern machinery now rumbles where once only hooves and breath could be heard, the essence of the plough remains. In its movement is the story of beginning, of care, of renewal. Even now, in our restless, rushing age, there are those who rise early and walk to the edge of a field. They may drive a machine, but they still check the depth of the cut. They still feel the weather in their bones. They still pause before beginning and take one last look at the unbroken earth. In some small gardens and distant places, wooden ploughs still move forward, pulled by tired oxen, guided by hands no different from those of 3,000 years ago. The blade turns the soil, the the seed follows, and the sun rises. Nothing more is needed. Perhaps this is the true legacy of the plough. Not invention, not revolution, but constancy. In a world that forgets easily, that hastens forward, the plough reminds us of the quiet virtue of repetition. It says, return to the beginning, start again, trust the process. There is work to be done, but there is meaning in the work. It asks for nothing but time, and gives in return the conditions of life itself. So, as we close the gate behind us and walk back along the path, let us remember this quiet companion, not as a relic, but as a witness. A humble implement, yes, but one that has carried humanity through the furrows of history, one patient step at a time. And still it waits beside the field in the low light of morning, ready, as always, to begin again. Thank you for walking so gently through the long furrows of history with me. We've now reached the end of our slow and steady journey through the invention of plough. From the digging stick to the steel share, from Neolithic clearings to modern furrows, we've followed a path not shaped by drama, but by daily patience, by the quiet, deliberate motion of soil turning under hand and hoof. If you'd ever like to wander through another story, just say the word, something soft, something steady, something to help you rest. Sleep well, and until next time, may your thoughts fall slowly like dusk across a field.